Thanks for being here and listening. This is your chance to switch off, slow down, and listen to the life of another. Each episode we give voice to someone from history or myth. Not the version told in textbooks or legends, but their own quiet reflection. Today we hear from Alexander, king, conqueror, legend, but even the man who ruled half the known world was still just a person. Tonight he looks back on a life shaped by ambition and wonders what it all really meant. This is My Name Was Alexander.
My name was Alexander, but names, I have learned, are curious things. They outlive the flesh that bore them, outlive the voice that spoke them into being. They become vessels for stories we never meant to tell, legends we never meant to live. In the stillness between sleeping and waking, I sometimes wonder if I was ever truly Alexander at all, or if I was always something else. A dream of empire that borrowed a mortal form, a fever that burned across the world and called itself a king. They say I conquered the known world before my 33rd year. But conquest is such a violent word for what felt, in those moments, like coming home to places I had never seen, like remembering cities that existed only in the whispered promises my tutor once made beneath the olive trees of Misa. Let me tell you about names and dreams and the weight of carrying both. I was 13 when I first understood that some bonds transcend the merely human. It was in the dusty courtyard of Pella, where my father Philip was examining a stallion that no man could master. The horse was magnificent, black as a moonless night, with eyes that held the fury of storms. The horse dealers spoke in hushed, embarrassed tones. 13 talents of silver for an animal that could not be ridden. A fortune for a beast that seemed to hate the very sight of men. But I saw something they did not. I saw the way Bucephalus, for that would become his name, turned always to face the sun. I saw how his shadow fell behind him like a dark banner, and how he reared not in malice, but in terror of the dancing spectre that mimicked his every move. "Father," I said, my voice still cracking with youth, "the horse is afraid of his own shadow." Philip's court fell silent. These men who had watched me struggle with geometry and rhetoric, who had seen me stumble over the conjugations of verbs in languages both dead and living, they watched as I approached the trembling giant. I turned Bucephalus toward the sun. His shadow fell behind us both, invisible to his rolling eyes. My small hand found the silk of his muzzle, and in that touch, something passed between us. Not mastery, I was never his master, but recognition. Here was another creature born to carry burdens too large for his frame. When I swung myself onto his back, the world changed. Not just because I had tamed an untamable horse, but because I understood, for the first time, what it meant to be chosen. Bucephalus had not submitted to me. He had recognized in me a kindred spirit, another soul destined to run toward horizons that others feared to approach. "By the gods," my father breathed, and there was pride in his voice, but something else too, something that might have been worry. "This boy will need a kingdom to match his ambition." A kingdom. Such a small word for what I would need. Aristotle came to us like a gift wrapped in rough cloth. The great philosopher, teacher of kings, had agreed to tutor the young prince of Macedon in a place called Mieza, a sanctuary of learning built around natural springs, where the water ran so clear you could see your soul reflected in its depths. For 3 years I lived in that garden of knowledge, and those may have been the most peaceful years of my life. Not because they were without struggle. The mind, I learned, can be a more challenging battlefield than any earthly plane. But because in struggling to understand the world, I began to understand myself. Aristotle was not what I had expected. Where I had imagined fire and thunder, I found gentleness and precision. He spoke of the golden mean as we walked among the pomegranate trees, explaining how virtue lived not in extremes, but in the careful balance between them. Courage, he said, was the mean between cowardice and recklessness. I wonder now if he saw, even then, how far I would stray from that golden path. "Tell me about Homer," he would say, as we sat by the springs, the manuscript of the Iliad spread between us like a map to undiscovered countries. "What does Achilles want?" "Glory," I would answer, too quickly, too eagerly. "Immortality," Aristotle would correct, his voice gentle but firm. "Glory fades with the men who remember it. But immortality, that is something else, entirely. Something more dangerous." He taught me to dissect the bodies of animals, to understand the intricate machinery of life. Under his guidance, I learned that the heart was not the seat of courage, as poets claimed, but merely a pump, efficient, necessary, but ultimately just flesh and blood. The real mystery lay in the breath, the pneuma that animated all things and connected them to the divine. "Every living thing reaches toward something," he told me, as we watched a vine stretch itself toward sunlight. "Plants reach for light, animals for food and safety. But rational creatures, we reach for something more complex. We reach for our own potential." I understood him to mean that we reach for excellence, for the full flowering of our nature. I did not understand, could not then, that some potentials are too vast for any single life to contain. In the evenings, we would debate the nature of justice, the ideal forms of government, the relationship between the particular and the universal. Aristotle believed in moderation, in the small, manageable polis where citizens could know one another and govern wisely. But even as he spoke, I felt something restless stirring in my chest, a hunger for something larger, more encompassing. "What if," I asked him once, as the sun set behind the olive groves, "what if the ideal polis is not small but infinite? What if justice is not local but universal?" He smiled at me then with the fondness of a teacher who recognizes that his student will surpass him, perhaps catastrophically. "Then you would need to become something more than human to rule it," he said. And the last man who tried that was struck down by lightning. But I was 16, and lightning seemed like a fair trade for immortality. Persepolis burned for 3 days and 3 nights, and I have carried the light of those flames in my dreams ever since. We had marched across the world to reach that place, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the seat of Darius's power, the mother city that had spawned 1,000 tributary settlements across the known world. For months, my armies had moved like a great bronze serpent across the mountains and deserts of Asia, following the ancient roads that connected civilization to civilization. But when we finally stood before those great stone stairways, when we saw the towering columns and the carved reliefs depicting tribute-bearers from every corner of the earth, something in me shifted. This was not just another city to be conquered. This was the heart of the world, the place where East and West had met and mingled for centuries beyond counting. My soldiers saw treasure, and there was treasure, more gold and silver than exists in some entire kingdoms. But I saw something else. I saw the library of Xerxes, where the wisdom of nations had been gathered and preserved. I saw workshops where craftsmen had perfected arts that we Macedonians were only beginning to learn. I saw gardens where flowers from distant lands grew in careful harmony, proof that beauty could be cultivated across the boundaries of culture and race. And yet, the wine flowed freely that night, as it always did after victory. But this wine tasted different, bitter with the salt of tears, sweet with the honey of revenge. For we had not forgotten what the Persians had done to Athens, what they had done to the sacred places of Greece. The ghosts of Marathon and Thermopylae walked among us, demanding satisfaction. It was Thais who spoke first, Thais the courtesan, Thais the lover of my general Ptolemy, Thais whose beauty was matched only by her fierce intelligence. She rose from her couch like a goddess, ascending to deliver judgment, and her words cut through the wine-soaked air like a blade through silk. "Should we not," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, "offer a torch to the goddess Athena? Should we not repay the Persians in kind for what they did to her sacred city?" The cheer that went up from my men was like thunder rolling across the mountains. Here was justice, they cried. Here was the balance that the gods demanded. Here was the flame that would purify the world of Persian pride. But as I held the torch in my hands, as I felt its heat against my face, and saw the eager eyes of my companions waiting for me to become the instrument of divine retribution, I hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, I saw not just Persepolis, but all the cities it represented. I saw the Persian mothers who would weep for their children, the craftsmen whose life's work would turn to ash, the scholars whose books would feed flames instead of minds. I saw the future that might have been, a world where Greek reason and Persian wisdom combined to create something greater than either could achieve alone. But I also saw my men, their faces bright with anticipation, their souls hungry for the satisfaction that only total victory could provide. I saw the ghosts of the Greek dead, waiting for their long-delayed revenge. I saw my father's dream of Hellenic supremacy balanced on the tip of a torch. So I threw it. The flames caught with unseemly eagerness, racing along the cedar beams and the precious tapestries, as if they too had been waiting centuries for this moment. The great palace that had housed the dreams of Cyrus and Darius became a pyre for the ambitions of Alexander. We danced as it burned, my Macedonians and I. We sang the songs of our homeland and told stories of gods and heroes, while the greatest library in the world turned to smoke above our heads. We celebrated justice, while wisdom died in the flames around us. But in the morning, when the wine had cleared from my head and the ashes settled on the ground like grey snow, I walked alone through the ruins of what we had destroyed. Among the blackened stones and twisted metal, I found fragments, a piece of carved ivory depicting a Persian garden, a melted golden cup that had once held wine from vines that grew beside the Caspian Sea, the charred remains of a manuscript written in a script I could not read. It was then I understood what I had truly done. I had not just conquered Persepolis, I had murdered it. And in doing so, I had killed not just a city, but a dream. The dream of what the world might become when all its peoples learned to speak the same language of wisdom and beauty. They call me Alexander the Great, but I wonder sometimes if that night in Persepolis was when I became Alexander the Destroyer instead. By the time I reached the oracle of Zeus Ammon in the Siwa oasis, I no longer knew if I was seeking the god or if the god was seeking me. The desert crossing had been brutal. 7 days through shifting sands under a sun that seemed determined to strip away everything merely human about my army and me. We had followed stories and rumors, chasing the promise of an oracle older than memory, hoping to find answers to questions I was not even sure I knew how to ask. But when we finally reached that green jewel set in an ocean of golden sand, when we saw the palm trees and the sacred springs that had drawn pilgrims for 1,000 years, I felt something I had not experienced since childhood, awe. The priests received me with ceremony, but also with a strange familiarity, as if they had been expecting me. They led me through passages carved from living rock, past walls covered with hieroglyphs that told stories older than Troy, older than the first king of Macedon. And then, in the innermost sanctuary, where the sacred ram's horns curled like frozen music in the lamplight, the high priest spoke the words that would change everything. "Hail, son of Zeus." Not son of Philip, not Alexander of Macedon, son of Zeus. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I could not breathe. Was this what I had come seeking? Or was it something I had been running from all my life? I thought of my father Philip, with his scarred face and his practical wisdom, his ability to turn enemies into allies and chaos into order. I thought of my mother Olympias, with her midnight rituals and her serpents, her claims that my true father was not mortal, but divine. I thought of the nights when I was young, and she would whisper to me of destinies greater than any earthly throne. "Ask your question, son of Zeus," the priest said, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the wind moving through the palm fronds outside. But what question could I ask? I had come here hoping to learn whether I would conquer the world, whether my name would endure, whether the empire I was building would survive my death. Such small questions now, for one who had just been declared the child of the King of Gods. Instead, I heard myself asking, will I be punished for what I have done? The silence stretched between us like a taut bowstring. When the priest finally spoke, his words were not an answer, but another question. What punishment could be greater than becoming what you are becoming? I left the oracle with no clearer understanding of my destiny, but with a terrible new weight settling on my shoulders. If I was truly the son of Zeus, then my actions were not just those of a mortal king, but of a divine force reshaping the world. Every city I conquered, every culture I absorbed or destroyed, every life I took or spared. These were not merely political acts, but theological ones. The knowledge changed me, as I suppose divine knowledge always changes those who receive it. I began to see myself from the outside, as my soldiers saw me, as history would see me. I watched Alexander the Great make decisions that Alexander the man might have made differently. When the Sogdian nobles offered me their daughters in marriage, Alexander the man might have chosen for love or even simple desire. Alexander the Great chose Roxana because their union would symbolize the merger of East and West, the creation of a new kind of civilization under divine auspices. When my friend Clytus drank too much wine and dared to criticize my adoption of Persian customs, Alexander the man might have laughed it off or argued back with the freedom of old friendship. Alexander the Great put a spear through his heart and then wept for 3 days over what divine wrath looked like when it wore a human face. The terrible thing about becoming divine is that you can no longer afford to be wrong. Gods do not make mistakes. They make cosmic course corrections. What mortals call cruelty, gods call necessity. What mortals call madness, gods call vision. But in the dark hours before dawn, when even gods must face themselves, I sometimes wondered if the priest at Siwa had been asking not about punishment, but about mercy. For what mercy could be greater than being allowed to remain merely human? India was where I learned that even the son of Zeus could reach too far. We had been marching for 8 years by then, 8 years of victories that felt more like fever dreams than battles. We had crossed rivers that no Greek had ever seen, climbed mountains that touched the roof of the world, fought enemies who rode elephants like moving fortresses, and whose kingdoms were older than our oldest myths. But at the Hyphasis River, the bees, as the Indians called it, my army finally said no. They had followed me across the known world and beyond it. They had adapted to climates that turned bronze green and leather to dust. They had learned to fight in formations their grandfathers could never have imagined, against weapons that existed in no Greek armory. They had married women whose languages they could not speak, and fathered children who would grow up calling foreign lands home. But they would go no further. It was Coenus who spoke for them. Coenus, one of my father's old companions, a man whose beard had been grey when mine was still soft down. He rose in the council tent while the monsoon rain drummed against the leather walls like the fingers of impatient gods. "Alexander," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every mile we had marched. "We have followed you to the edge of the world. We have seen the sunrise from places where it has never been seen by Macedonian eyes. But we are not gods, and this is not our home." Around the tent, I saw the faces of men who had been with me since we crossed the Hellespont, faces burned dark by foreign suns, scarred by weapons that had no Greek names, marked by years of sleeping under stars that belonged to other people's constellations. They looked at me with love, still, but also with something that might have been pity. "There are wonders beyond that river," I told them. "Kingdoms rich with gold and knowledge, peoples who have never heard of Macedon or Greece. We could die," Coenus interrupted, and the simple truth of it hung in the air like incense. "We could die in a land so far from home that our ghosts would never find their way back to the fields where we were born." That night, alone in my tent, I wept for the first time since I was a child. Not from sorrow exactly, but from a loneliness so complete it felt like drowning. I had become something that could not be satisfied by any earthly conquest, could not be contained by any single lifetime, could not be understood by anyone who had not felt the terrible hunger that drives a soul beyond the boundaries of the merely human. I thought of Bucephalus, who had died in India just months before, his great heart finally giving out after carrying me across half the world. I had buried him with honors fit for a king, founded a city in his name. But no city could fill the absence of the one creature who had truly understood what it meant to run toward horizons that others feared to approach. I thought of Hephaestion, my dearest friend, my other self, who had shared my dreams and my bed, and my vision of what the world could become. But even Hephaestion had limits, had moments when he looked at me as if I were becoming something he could no longer recognize or reach. In the end, I gave the order to turn back. Not because I was satisfied, I would never be satisfied, but because even gods, it seems, must sometimes bow to the limitations of those they love. But as we began the long journey home, as we sailed down the Indus toward the sea and the road back to Babylon, I felt something die in me. Not hope, exactly, but the innocence that had allowed me to believe that wanting something badly enough was the same as deserving it. The world, I learned, is larger than any single dream of conquest, and sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to stop reaching for more. Babylon in summer, is a furnace that forges either gods or ghosts. I arrived there in the 13th year of my reign, in the 32nd year of my life, carrying the weight of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India, from the Danube to the Persian Gulf. The city welcomed me, as cities had learned to welcome Alexander, with parades and protocols, with gifts and genuflections, with the careful choreography of surrender disguised as celebration. But Babylon felt different, older, more patient, as if it had seen conquerors come and go for so many centuries that it no longer bothered to fear them. The Chaldean priests met me at the gates, with warnings wrapped in diplomacy. The stars, they said, were unfavorable for a king entering Babylon from the west. Better to wait, to approach from another direction, to appease the gods with sacrifices and ceremonies. I should have listened. But I was 32 and immortal, the son of Zeus and master of the world. What did I care for the whispered fears of old men who read meaning in the movements of distant lights? Besides, there was so much to do. An empire to reorganize, new cities to plan, fresh campaigns to imagine. I had been dreaming of Arabia, of the lands beyond the great desert, where incense grew on trees and pearls formed in oysters the size of shields. I had been planning expeditions to the north, where the Scythians rode horses swift as storm clouds, and to the west, where the Celts painted themselves blue and worshipped gods in groves of oak. The world was still so large, and I was still so young. But the fever came anyway, as perhaps it had always been. Coming. It started as a headache after a night of heavy drinking with my officers. Nothing unusual. We had been celebrating the successful completion of repairs to Babylon's ancient irrigation system, one of those mundane but essential tasks that empire requires. But this headache felt different, deeper, as if something were burning behind my eyes. Then came the chills, then the sweats, then the strange clarity that sometimes accompanies the approach of death. Lying in the great bed that had once belonged to Nebuchadnezzar, surrounded by physicians who spoke in whispers and administered remedies that tasted of desperation, I found myself thinking not of the empire I was leaving behind, but of the boy I had been. I remembered the garden at Mysa, where Aristotle had taught me that excellence was a habit, not an accident. I remembered the day I had first mounted Bucephalus, when the world had opened before me like a flower. I remembered my father's proud smile, my mother's fierce ambitions, the weight of expectations that had shaped me from my first breath. Had I fulfilled those expectations? Had I become what they had dreamed I would become? Or had I become something else, something that bore the name Alexander, but answered to hungers no mortal was meant to feel? As the fever climbed, I began to see things. Not visions exactly, but memories that seemed more real than the present moment. I saw again the Persian soldiers at Gaugamela, their faces bright with terror and courage as they charged toward what they knew was their doom. I saw the smoke rising from Persepolis, carrying with it the dreams of centuries. I saw the Indus at flood, brown and vast and indifferent to the ambitions of kings. My generals came to see me, these men who had followed me across the world and back again. Perdiccas, with his careful loyalty and his secret ambitions. Ptolemy, already calculating how to turn my death into his advantage. Cassander, who had never forgiven me for killing his father. Seleucus, who understood that empires were built not by conquest, but by administration. They asked me who should inherit, who should rule the empire we had built together. I should have named my son, my unborn child growing in Roxana's womb. I should have divided the kingdom among them like a father, distributing gifts to worthy children. I should have made some provision for the continuation of what we had created. Instead, I whispered the words that would doom my empire to 40 years of civil war. To the strongest. Not because I was cruel, but because I understood, finally, what I had always been building. Not a kingdom that could be inherited like land or gold, but a dream that could only be earned. Not a stable dynasty, but a divine madness that would inspire men to reach beyond themselves until they too burned bright enough to reshape the world. They say I died in Babylon on the 10th day of the month of Daisios, in the 114th Olympiad, having lived 32 years and 8 months. They say my body did not decay for 7 days, proof of my divine nature. They say my last words were a mystery, and my final gesture a silence that spoke louder than any proclamation. But death, I learned, is just another kind of journey, and like all journeys, it shows you things you could not see while you were moving. From this place beyond, flesh and time and the weight of crowns, I can see what my name became. I can see how it spread across the world like spores on the wind, taking root in places I never imagined, growing into stories I never meant to tell. In Alexandria, not the Egyptian city, but the one in Bactria, where Greek columns cast shadows on Buddhist statues, I see merchants speaking Greek to Chinese silk traders, their transactions blessed by gods whose names exist in no Homeric hymn. This too is Alexander, the marriage of impossibly distant things, the creation of a world where nothing is purely itself anymore. In the palace schools of Rome, I see children learning to read with copies of the Iliad that traveled west in the packs of Macedonian soldiers. They mispronounce Achilles' name and add Latin endings to Greek roots, but they still dream of glory that outlasts the body that wins it. This too is Alexander, the hunger for immortality disguised as education. In the court of some unborn emperor whose capital will rise beside the Thames, I see scholars debating whether I was a hero or a tyrant, a civilizer or a destroyer. They will never agree, because I was always both, the bright flame that illuminates and the fire that consumes. This too is Alexander, the eternal argument between what we achieve and what we destroy in the achieving. But there are other echoes, quieter ones. In a village whose name I never learned, somewhere in the mountains between Sogdia and India, I see an old woman teaching her granddaughter to weave patterns that combine Macedonian spirals with Persian flowers and Indian elephants. She does not know my name, but she carries the world I made in the threads of her tapestry. This too is Alexander, the mixing of peoples so complete that it becomes invisible, so natural that it seems to have always been. In a library that will not be built for 1,000 years, I see a man with dark skin and careful eyes translating Aristotle into a language my tutor never heard, adding footnotes that reference scholars from Cordoba and Cairo and Samarkand. He has never heard of Bucephalus or Mysa or the wine-dark sea, but he inherits the dream of knowledge without borders. This too is Alexander, the gift of curiosity that recognizes no boundaries of race or creed. These are the victories that matter, the conquests that endure. Not the cities that bear my name, though 34 of them do, scattered from Egypt to Afghanistan, like stepping stones across a river of time. Not the kingdoms my generals carved from my empire's corpse, though they too carry forward something of what we dreamed together in the early years, when the world seemed small enough to hold in our hands. The victory that matters is this, that after me, the world could never again be a collection of separate peoples who knew nothing of each other's dreams. After Alexander, there would always be roads between civilizations, always translators working by lamplight to render foreign wisdom into familiar words, always merchants willing to carry not just goods, but gods across the spaces between what had once seemed like separate worlds. I spent my life trying to become immortal, and perhaps I succeeded. Not as the god I thought I wanted to become, but as the idea I never knew I was creating. The idea that boundaries exist to be crossed, that differences exist to be bridged, that the human heart is large enough to hold the entire world if we only have the courage to let it expand. And so I rest now in the place where all stories go when they have been told enough times to become true. Not in the golden tomb they built for me in Alexandria, though that too became a story, how emperors and kings made pilgrimage to look upon the face of Alexander, how my body became a relic as famous as my name. But here, in the space between sleeping and waking, where names become their meanings and meanings become dreams, I am finally at peace. No more cities to found, no more horizons to chase, no more burden of carrying divine ambitions in a mortal frame. Here I can remember without regret the boy who whispered secrets to his horse, who learned wisdom in a garden beside clear springs, who believed that wanting something badly enough was the same as deserving it. Here I can forgive the man who burned libraries in the name of justice, who killed friends in the name of divinity, who turned back from the edge of the world not because he had conquered enough, but because love, finally, proved stronger than ambition. Sometimes, in dreams that feel more real than memory, I see him again, Bucephalus, black coat gleaming like polished night, waiting for me in some eternal stable where the hay is always fresh and the water always clear. When I mount him, we ride not toward conquest, but toward understanding, not toward glory, but toward the simple joy of movement itself. And sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn touches the world of waking, I feel them, all the lives that touched mine, all the names that became entangled with my name in the great web of story that history weaves. Aristotle still teaching patience to impatient princes, Philip still dreaming of a united Greece, Hephaestion still standing at my shoulder, as we look out over kingdoms we will never rule. Even Darius is there, no longer my enemy, but my partner in the eternal dance of empire and resistance. The king who made my victories meaningful by making them difficult. This is what immortality looks like, I think. Not the preservation of the body or even the memory, but the continuation of the conversation. Somewhere tonight, in some classroom or library or late-night discussion between friends, someone is still arguing about whether I was a hero or a villain, still trying to understand what it means to want the whole world and almost get it. Somewhere tonight, someone is still reading Homer by lamplight and dreaming of glory that outlasts the flesh. Someone is still taming horses by turning them toward the sun. Someone is still learning that excellence is a habit, not an accident, and wondering if they have the courage to make it their own. My name was Alexander, but names, as I said, are curious things. They become vessels for stories we never meant to tell, dreams we never meant to dream, possibilities we never knew we were creating. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that was always enough.